Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for bearing with us as we work through some technical difficulties. I'm so pleased to invite you all to our session this morning, where we're spotlighting the Global Slavery Index. Just for a quick introduction, we are WalkFree. We're an international human rights organisation based in Perth, Australia, and WalkFree is behind the Global Slavery Index, which is the most comprehensive data set on modern slavery globally. We launched our 5th edition on the 24th of May, and you'll see a massive book, which I think is about 400 pages, on your desk. If you don't mind carrying the extra weight, we really welcome you to take one of those. This is sort of our flagship publication, and we're so pleased to have launched the 5th edition a couple of weeks ago and be sharing it with you now. So this morning we'll take a little bit of a different focus. We'll talk about the key regional findings in there, and being a responsible business and human rights forum, we're going to focus more on the forced labour side rather than the forced marriage side of modern slavery. So it's actually our privilege to be here. Obviously being based in Perth, Western Australia, not the highest concentration of human rights organisations there. So it's really great to be here with you all today. I'll just take you on a little run through of this session. So first up, we're going to hear from the Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Slavery, Professor Tomoyo Obokata. He'll open for us. We'll then pass over to our research team who are here. There's Elise, Gabrielle, and Brittany. And following that, we'll have a question and answer, and then we'll move into a different format. This is something we like to call a shift and share. It's just an opportunity for you to really dig deeper into 4 different focus areas. So we have investing in modern slavery, importing risks. There's a deep dive on our methodology. So how do we measure modern slavery? And then finally, how can you use our tools? They'll be at different stations in the room, and we have an hour. Each session will be 20 minutes. So you get to choose 3 of those and move around the room that way. And unfortunately for our participants on the online, that will just be for in-person attendees, though I understand the webinar will keep running as it will keep running all day. For those of you who speak Thai, I'd just like to flag that the Thai interpretation is marked in Zoom as Chinese. So make sure you select that option if you are here in Thai or online. All right, well, without further ado, I would love to hand over to Mr. Tomoyo Obokata. He's joining us from Japan. The Special Rapporteur is currently the Professor for Law and Human Rights at Keele University in the UK. And his mandate includes looking into the causes and consequences of contemporary forms of modern slavery, and it's an honour that he can join us today. So we'll hand over to him now.
Oh, good morning. Can you hear me?
Brilliant. Yeah. Yes. Do you have your camera there that we can turn on?
No, I don't seem to be able to switch on because it says the host is controlling the camera, so I cannot switch on myself.
Okay. We will just try to work on this for 1 second. Thank you. Would you mind trying again to turn your camera on, please? Oh, brilliant. We can see you.
It's working. Great.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, great. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to this side event. I'm sorry that I could not be there because I'm currently in Japan, my own country. I'll be participating in a consumer goods forum event tomorrow. So my apologies. I was there last year, but this year, unfortunately, I'm away. Now, I'd like to begin by congratulating WalkFree for publishing the latest edition of the Global Slavery Index. I have no doubt that it will serve as an important source of information for governmental and non-governmental stakeholders. Now, you probably have heard about the global statistics on contemporary forms of slavery, so I won't repeat those, but I'd like to emphasize that Asia and the Pacific are affected by forced labor the most, followed by Europe and Central Asia, Africa, the Americas, and Arab states. 5 sectors are said to be affected by this the most, and they are services, manufacturing, construction, agriculture, and domestic work. Particularly vulnerable groups include women, children and young people, minorities, indigenous peoples, migrant workers, including refugees and asylum seekers, older workers, and workers with disabilities. In terms of the key causes of labor exploitation, there are structural ones such as ongoing poverty, inequality, and discrimination affecting these populations. There are also wider causes such as armed conflict, natural disasters, and the COVID-19 pandemic, which have left many people displaced, unemployed, and/or homeless, and many have experienced contemporary forms of slavery as a result. When I assumed my role a few years ago, I promised to focus on these vulnerable groups for my thematic report to the UN Human Rights Council with a view to promoting a victim-centered approach. In 2021, for example, I looked at how internally displaced persons, refugees, and asylum seekers are vulnerable to labor exploitation as they don't have access to essential public services and decent work in many cases. Last year, I looked at the experiences of minorities, including migrant workers. I made a reasonable conclusion that the indicators of forced labor exist in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, among others. People and communities discriminated on work and descent constitute another vulnerable group who often are victimized in debt bondage and other forms of labor exploitation. I am also concerned about the existence of child labor in the Asia and Pacific. The structural causes I mentioned earlier force many parents to send their children to work instead of schools. In South Asia alone, it is estimated that 17 million children are in child labor. Although not all forms of labor rendered by children are exploitative, I have seen instances of the worst forms of child labor in various sectors in the region. And it is clear that much more needs to be done in the Asia and Pacific to improve the current situation. In this regard, governments and businesses in the region should strengthen human rights due diligence. Positive developments are emerging, like the creation of national action plans and guidelines, but there is no denying the fact that an increasing emphasis is placed upon mandatory due diligence. That is to say, legally forcing businesses and employers to identify, assess, mitigate, and prevent risks of human rights violations, including contemporary forms of slavery. And when failing to do so, they will face penalties such as fines or prohibition from public procurement. These arrangements are particularly strong in Europe, where a number of countries already have legislation on mandatory due diligence, and the European Parliament just last week voted in favor of the European Union-wide approach. In the Americas, import ban on goods which are produced as a result of forced labor have been implemented in Canada, the United States, and Mexico, among others. Now, these may look like remote measures, but business operations in Asia and the Pacific are already affected by these because of the existence of supply chains in the region. It is also important to recognize the role of civil society organizations, trade unions, and workers' organizations in monitoring the implementation of human rights due diligence on the ground. They are also at the forefront of preventing labor exploitation and protection of workers' rights, and their work must be properly supported. In my view, what is needed is a joined-up approach with all governmental and non-governmental stakeholders working collaboratively to promote good practice in implementing human rights due diligence and preventing contemporary forms of slavery. And I am determined to play my part in facilitating such an approach. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to working with you in the future. Please do not hesitate to contact me directly if there's anything I can do to support your work. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Professor Obokata. We're very privileged that you could join us, and thank you for all the work that you do on this important topic. I would now love to hand over to our research team. So 3 from our research team. So we have Elise Gordon, who's the Manager of Global Research. We also have Gabrielle Ashworth and Brittany Kwai, and they are both research analysts who focus on Asia and the Pacific. And they've been working on this GSI for some time, and it's just, pulled together to be an amazing piece of work. I can say that because I had nothing to do with it. So please, welcome the research team. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm Elise, as Charlotte warmly introduced. I'm the research manager at WalkFree, and I'm joined by our WalkFree research analysts, Brittany Kwai and Gabby Ashworth. And it's my pleasure to introduce the Global Slavery Index before I hand over to Brittany and Gabby, who will present the key findings. So as Charlotte mentioned at the start of the presentation, WalkFree does create the Global Slavery Index, and it is the world's most comprehensive data set on modern slavery. And we do this, and we use this data to advocate for change, working with governments and regulators, businesses and investors, faith leaders and communities to drive policy change. And we partner directly with frontline organizations to impact the lives of those vulnerable to modern slavery. We also work with survivors of modern slavery to strengthen our research and advocacy. And we recognize that lived experience is expertise, and that survivors are central to identifying lasting solutions. I realize that many of you in the room are probably already familiar with modern slavery, the terminology, but it is used differently in different countries and by different organizations. So I thought I'd just sort of run through it again here before we get stuck into the key findings. So modern slavery includes forced labor, forced sexual exploitation, debt bondage, slavery and slavery-like practices such as forced marriage, worse forms of child labor, such as the sale and exploitation of children, and human trafficking for any of these purposes. So these are all extreme forms of exploitation that a person cannot refuse or leave because of threats, violence, coercion, deception, and or abuse of power. So in practice, this may be the seasonal worker from the Pacific Islands picking fruit in the Australian horticulture sector, whose employer has threatened to report him to officials for immigration violations if he does not keep working. Or it could be the Filipino fisher on a Taiwanese fishing vessel who has accrued a large unmanageable debt through his recruitment process that he must pay if he's able to leave. Or it could be the migrant domestic worker in Singapore who's had her passport confiscated by her employer and is unable to return home. So in terms of the GSI journey, the GSI is the shorthand for the Global Slavery Index. It has been 10 years since we first created and launched the Global Slavery Index, and we've come a long way in that time. In 2013, our first edition, our method wasn't based on survey data. In 2014, we had only 7 national surveys. In 2018, our 4th edition, we had 48 surveys and identified exploitation in 79 countries. In this edition, the 2023 edition, we have 75 surveys and we've identified exploitation in 129 countries. And through each edition of the Global Slavery Index, our understanding of the problem has deepened. And so what does this edition of the Global Slavery Index cover? So regardless of the evolution of the methodology, the Global Slavery Index has always been designed to be a tool for civil society, business, and governments, and has been designed to answer 3 questions. Firstly, what is the extent of modern slavery at the country level? What makes people in a country vulnerable to modern slavery? And what are governments doing to respond to modern slavery? As we increased the data collection over the editions of the Global Slavery Index, we were able to start counting modern slavery where it was happening, and our findings showed much higher prevalence in wealthy countries than we had previously thought. This led us to look more closely at the largest economies across the world, the G20 countries, who generate a great deal of demand for products, many of them made with forced labour. So to get us into the key findings of this edition, I will now pass over to Gabby.
Oh, thanks, Elise. So we know that almost 50 million people are living in modern slavery around the world. And of this number, approximately 28 million people were in forced labour and 22 million were in forced marriages. Importantly, this represents a 10 million increase in the number of people living in modern slavery since the 2018 Global Slavery Index. So women, children, and migrants remain disproportionately impacted by these issues. More than 12 million people in modern slavery are children, and migrant workers are 3 times more likely to be in forced labour than non-migrant workers. So the Global Slavery Index is a national breakdown of the extent of modern slavery in 160 countries. To give you an idea of the scale of research, as Elise mentioned, we drew on the largest survey ever conducted of this kind, covering 75 countries. And this involved a mix of face-to-face interviews as well as telephone interviews, covering almost 110,000 respondents. So our analysis of government responses draws on almost 25,000 data points covering 176 countries. And this involves extensive reviews of country laws and policies, literature reviews, and interviewing survivors and NGOs with experience in specific countries. So modern slavery, as you can see, is taking place all over the world. The 10 countries with the highest prevalence of modern slavery, which is the number of people in modern slavery per 1,000 individuals in the country, are listed to the left of the map. And these countries do share some political, social, and economic characteristics. Many are in volatile regions, several have authoritarian governments or governments that are perpetrating state-imposed forced labor of some kind. And countries such as Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Kuwait host millions of migrant workers who are particularly vulnerable to extreme forms of exploitation. The largest number of people living in modern slavery can be found on the right of the map. Collectively, these countries account for nearly 2 in every 3 people living in modern slavery around the world. And you'll note that 6 of these countries with the most amount of people living in modern slavery are in our Asia Pacific region. So if we look at the government responses to modern slavery, we can see that the countries that have taken the most action are on the left of the map and the least action on the right. So the top 10 countries taking the most action tend to have more resources available, relatively strong political will, and civil society presence to hold the government to account. So notably in 2018 in Australia, we saw the government pass its Modern Slavery Act, which requires companies with a consolidated revenue of over 100 million Australian dollars to report on the actions that they are taking to address modern slavery. But we've also seen promising action outside of these top 10 countries. So since 2018, a further 15 governments have criminalized human trafficking in line with the United Nations Trafficking Protocol. And also, if we look at Thailand, since 2018, the government has introduced a national referral mechanism to ensure that survivors are being referred to support services, as well as ratified some critical international labour organisation conventions, such as the Protocol of 2014 to the Forced Labour Convention and the ILO Work and Fishing Convention. So the countries taking the least action to respond to modern slavery at the global level, such as North Korea, Eritrea, Iran, Libya, and Somalia, these countries continue to be characterized by conflict or active involvement from the government in modern slavery, either through corruption and complicity or through state-imposed forced labor. So although there has been notable progress in the last 5 years, we have generally seen a lot of stagnation in terms of the response to modern slavery. The current actions of governments are not enough to address this issue, as we know that there are 10 million more people living in modern slavery since the last Global Slavery Index. The G20 countries, who have significant influence in the global economy, they have a huge responsibility to act in this space, and these governments are still not doing enough to ensure that modern slavery is eradicated from public and private supply chains. So if we look at the regional level, Asia and the Pacific host the largest amount of people living in modern slavery, with almost 30 million people in situations of modern slavery on any given day in 2021. So this equates to a prevalence of 6.8 people per 1,000 in the region, with the highest prevalence found in North Korea, Afghanistan, and Myanmar. And of this number, 15 million people were in forced labor. So this includes debt bondage among migrants, hereditary forms of slavery in South Asia, and state-imposed forced labor in countries such as North Korea and China. For those interested, the Global Slavery Index does estimate that on any given day in 2021, there were 401,000 people living in modern slavery in Thailand, or 5.7 people for every 1,000. So this means that Thailand has the 14th highest prevalence in the Asia-Pacific region out of 27 countries. But notably, Thailand also has the 3rd strongest government response, as taking the strong action to address these crimes. We do note that government responses to modern slavery vary across the region, and so do resources that governments have available to dedicate to this response. But this tells us that regional collaboration is more important now than ever. So while the region is diverse and governments do have these varying responses to modern slavery, there are some key gaps across the region. We do urge governments in the Asia Pacific to ensure that support services are available for all survivors of modern slavery, that survivors are not punished for crimes committed while under the control of traffickers, and can access compensation restitution. We urge that labour laws cover all groups, including migrant workers, seafarers, domestic workers, those groups that are vulnerable, and that recruitment processes are sufficiently regulated. And we also recommend that governments introduce mandatory human rights due diligence to prevent governments and businesses sourcing goods or services that are linked to modern slavery. So this 10 million increase of people living in modern slavery in the last 5 years has occurred against a backdrop of compounding crises. So we saw the COVID-19 pandemic amplify and expose inequality and instability, and the effects of climate change have disproportionately impacted those who are already vulnerable, as its effects push people to migrate and magnify drivers of displacement, such as food insecurity or a loss of livelihoods. We know that conflict is further driving displacement and increasing the risk of trafficking and slavery around the world, particularly in countries that are experiencing protracted conflicts. Consumerism continues to drive demand for cheap products, which results in a race to the bottom for worker wages. So these compounding crises have caused significant disruption to employment and education, which has led to increases in extreme poverty and forced migration, which together heightens the risk of modern slavery. There are also some key industry links between the climate crisis and modern slavery. So modern slavery is linked to environmentally degrading industries with high climate change impacts. For example, the charcoal, cattle, and palm oil industries have been associated with forced labor, where workers who are in debt bondage are forced to clear forests. Then as the world moves towards sustainable energy to address the climate crisis, vulnerable workers are again exposed to greater risks of exploitation. So there is increasing evidence that renewable industries vital to our transition to clean energy are also reliant on forced labor for the mining, processing, and manufacturing of critical minerals and inputs. So, for example, risks have been identified throughout the solar energy value chain, from evidence of forced and child labour in the mining of cobalt in the Democratic Republic of the Congo to the production of polysilicon in the Uyghur region of China. So G20 countries collectively are importing almost 15 billion US dollars worth of solar panels that are at risk of being made with modern slavery. So government and business action to address both climate change and modern slavery and its intersections with conflict, displacement, gender, and industry supply chains are critical. So I'll pass over to Britt to discuss some of the key industry risks and how you can also leverage the Global Slavery Index.
Thanks, Gabby. So now that Gabby's taken us through the key findings and data, how can you use this information to serve your organisation's purpose? So firstly, the GSI highlights frontline perspectives, essays written by survivors and frontline advocates, as well as survivor stories feature throughout the report, offering important insights into key issues and effective solutions to modern slavery. And so we encourage you to consider these perspectives and embed meaningful survivor engagement in your work, whether it be implementing measures to strengthen worker voice in business or informing civil society interventions with survivor expertise at the centre. The GSI is also a tool to understand what governments are doing to respond to modern slavery and what gaps exist. So we assess government responses in 176 countries across over 140 indicators, and the data is available to explore in more detail on our website, which we'll go into more depth in the second half of this session. And we also provide detailed recommendations on actions governments should take. So for business, this can help you to understand what protections already exist in countries that you operate in, where you have your workforce or where you source goods from. For example, you can look at whether countries have sufficiently criminalised forms of modern slavery or whether they've enacted laws to protect vulnerable workers such as migrants. For civil society, gaps in the government's response can inform decisions on where to target your advocacy efforts and interventions, for example. Go to the next slide, please. So the GSI is a really comprehensive tool to understand the nature of modern slavery risk around the world. The country level prevalence data informs our understanding of geographic risk. And by looking at vulnerability, government response, country studies, and spotlights that also feature in the GSI, you'll get a much deeper understanding of the types of risks specific to countries, as well as the specific risks for different workforces and industries. So, for example, this can help businesses to assess risk or help civil society design and target interventions and advocacy. So with that said, I'll now share a little bit more about the import risks and sector-specific risks that we cover in the GSI. Next slide. So the GSI includes an analysis of products at risk of being made with forced labour that are imported by the G20 countries. And this is really important because while the prevalence estimates help us gain a better understanding of where modern slavery is happening around the world, it doesn't paint the full picture of responsibility. So wealthier countries tend to have lower prevalence of modern slavery, but their demand for goods fuels exploitation in countries at the front line of global supply chains. Workers are exploited across a range of sectors, and most forced labour occurs at the lowest tiers of the supply chain, in the extraction of raw materials and production stages. G20 nations account for more than 75% of the world's trade and import nearly $500 billion worth of products at risk of forced labour each year, $468 billion. And you'll again have an opportunity to dive a bit deeper into what import risk looks like for the G20 with Gabby in the second half of today's session. Next slide, please. So the GSI also features spotlights on high-risk sectors, including garments, cocoa, the financial sector, and also social media, where there's increasing risk of modern slavery being facilitated via platforms. For each of these sectors, we assessed how businesses are reporting on their efforts to address modern slavery in their operations and supply chains under the UK and Australian Modern Slavery Acts. Many of you in the room may be familiar, but if not, Modern Slavery Acts in the UK and Australia require certain companies who earn over a certain annual revenue to produce an annual statement on their efforts to address modern slavery. So while the modern slavery statements that we looked at showed some promising efforts to address the issue, across the board, companies aren't doing enough. So take the financial sector, like any business, financial institutions purchase goods and services at risk of modern slavery, whether it be catering or cleaning or office equipment, for example. But they're actually far more likely to be exposed through their investing and lending. And at the same time, they have significant leverage to be able to push for better practices in the companies that they invest in and lend to. But what we've seen when we've analysed modern slavery statements is that many investors aren't assessing and addressing risk in a robust way. There's very few examples of investors actually using their leverage to push for better practices in the companies that they invest in. But we're optimistic that we'll see more of that in the future. And we're already starting to see greater awareness across the financial sector around the risks of modern slavery in their portfolios. And some promising examples exist already. So in Thailand, for example, listed companies are required to annually report on sustainability issues, including human rights protection throughout the value chain. And in 2021, WalkFree partnered with the Stock Exchange of Thailand and Finance Against Slavery and Trafficking to produce guidance on modern slavery risks for Thai businesses, as well as a modern slavery benchmarking tool to help companies manage labour risks across a range of sectors and meet their sustainability reporting obligations. And again, you'll have a chance to hear more about this in the second half of the session. And then moving on to social media, there's also growing evidence that social media platforms are being used to facilitate modern slavery, which has been made easier by the anonymity provided by these platforms. So reports have emerged of users being lured via social media with false job advertisements, for example, and then trafficked to the Gulf countries for forced labour. Our assessment found that social media companies aren't doing enough to report on modern slavery within their supply chains. But we also wanted to look further beyond the Modern Slavery Act requirements and see how and whether social media companies are engaging with risks on the platforms themselves. As is often the case, technology has rapidly outpaced the development of the law, and there's very little regulation on this at the moment. One company reported making information on support services available to at-risk users on their platforms. Some of the companies also reported having policies against sexually explicit advertisements on platforms. But despite the known risks, companies didn't report having mechanisms in place to verify job ads, for example, that may be at risk of modern slavery, verifying that the jobs actually exist, and other practices. So we're recommending that governments introduce mandatory human rights due diligence laws that require businesses and other organisations to conduct due diligence proactively across the entire value chain, including end users, not just operations and supply chains. So if we take a closer look at the garment sector, there are risks of modern slavery at each stage of the supply chain, from growing and producing raw materials to processing these into inputs to manufacturing. Exploitative conditions include low wages, piece rate pay, forced and unpaid overtime, health and safety risks, and lack of benefits. And this can lead to debt bondage and forced labour, with conditions also worsening during the COVID-19 pandemic. The purchasing practices of brands can also drive labour exploitation in the supply chain. And our assessment found that brands are largely failing to address the sector-specific risks associated with the sector. So, for example, only 29% reported a living wage commitment for supply chain workers. And I wanted to highlight a quote here from Nazreen Sheikh, the CEO and founder of Empowerment Collective, and also the author of one of the essays featured in the GSI report. She says, "We need radical supply chain transparency and non-negotiable meaningful engagement from all businesses. We need modern slavery legislation that imposes the duty to protect all workers in supply chains, that holds companies liable for breaches and inaction, and that leaves no one behind in the pursuit of a thriving global economy." And I encourage you all to read Nazreen's essay in the GSI. The report also includes a spotlight on the fishing sector, which highlights the links between illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing and forced labour. Notably, Thailand is among the world's top seafood producers and is also among the top 7 countries deemed to have high-risk fisheries. The Thai government has adopted reforms to improve conditions since the 2018 Global Slavery Index. However, some concerns have been raised over their effective implementation. Across the board, increased action is required by governments, including those in flag, source, coastal, port, and market states, to increase protections for fishers. We also include an assessment of state-imposed forced labour in the Global Slavery Index. So evidence has emerged of egregious human rights violations and state-imposed forced labour of Uyghurs and other Turkic and Muslim majority groups in China, impacting several supply chains, including cotton, textiles, garments, solar panels, coal, chemicals, and plastics. Evidence of state-imposed forced labour was found in 17 countries globally, including 5 in the Asia-Pacific region. So this is an overview of some of the spotlights included in the Global Slavery Index. We do also have spotlights on orphanage trafficking, the kafala system, and conflict. So encourage everyone to have a look at those in the report. And alongside the report, we've also launched a new data portal on our website that allows you to explore all of the data behind the report. These interactive data sets allow you to look at the resources that we have available for a particular country, along with many other features. So we highly encourage you to look at the website. Slide please. On the website, we also have several resources for businesses, including a business and investor toolkit, a modern slavery response and remedy framework, and a modern slavery benchmarking tool. So again, in the next half of this session, we'll be doing a deeper dive into these resources and also the global data portal. So you can get a better understanding of how you can access those tools. And that concludes our presentation. And I think now we have some time for questions.
Thank you so much. That's really helpful. And yeah, I look forward to digging deeper myself into some of those areas. There's just so much to know about this topic, and really appreciate the overview that you provided for us this morning and now almost afternoon. So now we'll move into the Q&A. If you are online, please just type your questions into the chat and we'll read them out. But is there anybody in the room who has a question to begin with? I'll bring the microphone around to you if so. And I actually might have one to get us started. I noticed in the government response, North Korea scored negative. How can a country score negative in the government response?
To answer that one. So our government response framework is made up of 141 indicators across 5 milestones, just to give a bit of an overview. Annalise might go into this a little bit more in methodology, but we look at things such as whether countries have a hotline that the public are able to report instances of modern slavery to, whether they have a national action plan, whether they criminalise forced labour, forced marriage, and these are all rated either 0 if they don't meet the indicator or 1 if they do. But we also have some negative indicators. So, for example, if there's evidence that a government has detained migrant workers for immigration violations, that's a negative indicator, and they'll actually receive a -1 for that. So there's a few of those in the framework. And in the case of North Korea, they have met these negative indicators due to the presence of evidence of harmful practices, while also not meeting positive indicators due to lack of actions to address modern slavery. So that's why North Korea is negative in the government response.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Thanks. Shall we see if there are any other questions in the room? Yeah, sure. Come over to you.
Hi, thank you.
Oh, you have a microphone. Great.
Yes.
Thanks.
My name is Lukita. I work for UNICEF in Indonesia. My role is to advocate businesses for child rights. And then there is an interesting evidence that it's 52% of forced labor and then 48% of forced marriage. So I just wonder, do the analysis or the study also find an intersection, some things like from the 48% of forced marriage, do they also contribute to become a forced labor? Because we do found that kind of cases happening in Indonesia sometimes. And then that will lead to a higher risk on domestic violence and other vulnerability to their child. So then I just wonder if you found that kind of cross-cutting from the two portion of the forced labor and the forced marriage. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. That's a really good question. And yes, you're right. There absolutely is an intersection between forced marriage and forced labor. And while it's not something that we report on in the Global Slavery Index, we do capture those instances where a person reports that they were forced to marry, and then as part of that forced marriage, were forced to perform duties. So that is certainly something that we pick up in our surveys. We don't produce estimates on that, and that is really down to the number of cases at a country level. We just don't have big enough case numbers to be able to produce reliable estimates at this point in time. We would love to be able to produce those kind of estimates, but it requires much larger sample sizes for these kind of surveys. And so we very much encourage governments to undertake their own surveys on modern slavery so that they can have bigger sample sizes, because these are obviously quite resource intensive and costly when you're conducting tens of surveys across the world. So we certainly recommend that governments are conducting their own surveys on forced marriage and forced labour, which is how we tend to operationalise modern slavery in our own surveys. So yes, absolutely, we are seeing that forced labour and forced marriage are linked, but yes, unfortunately, we don't have any estimates on those.
Thank you for the report. Kanish Negi from Schneider Electric. We often see that forces or illicit practices around modern slavery, they are quite intricately linked to the socio-cultural practices, the economies, etc. Does the report or in your research, do you also cover instances or examples of successful interventions where companies would have initiated an intervention with the supply chain partners, with the suppliers, who are often in the emerging economies, a lot of it which is covered here, which could prove as to, let's say, give a solution that, okay, this is how companies should try to emulate the actions. That's first part. And also, is there any insight or nuance on the behavioral change? Because one is to recognize that, yes, this is a bad practice and we should not do it. That is an acquired lesson knowledge. But within the wider society, many of these practices are so deeply embedded that is part of individual behavior or as a collective behavior of or a collective cognizance of the society. So are there also any practices on challenging and changing these behavioral practices, which in a way encourage these kind of behavior as acceptable behavior given the regional context that they are? Thank you.
Yes, you're right. Absolutely, cultural practices do sometimes enable or exacerbate modern slavery. And we do look at some successful practices or promising practices, as we refer to them, throughout the Global Slavery Index, specifically in terms of promising practices from a business perspective. We don't have too many throughout the Global Slavery Index, but we do highlight a few. For example, Tony's Chocolate Only, which is a chocolate company based in the Netherlands, which is doing really great work to reduce the risk of forced labour in their supply chain. So we do feature some of the practices that they implement in order to try to achieve that. However, while it's not in the Global Slavery Index itself, WalkFree also has the Promising Practices Project, and that is an online database of promising practices, as the name suggests. So it's we compile evaluations of modern slavery programs, and we assess how effective those evaluations are, and basically we produce a summary of some of the most promising practices. So in there you'll also find those that are programs by businesses. However, I must note, as we do in the promising practices reports that we put out, that there are a real lack of evaluations of programs out there. So while we do look at evaluations that do exist, we know that there is really there are limited evaluations on modern slavery programs. So we would love to see more civil society, business, government conducting evaluations and publishing those evaluations, so we are able to better gauge what are the most effective interventions to address modern slavery. So yes, please, if of interest, have a look on our website. We have the Promising Practices database, and I'd be happy to chat more about that one.
I work on the business engagement team at WalkFree, and we do have a number of resources for companies. We'll be going through that in the deep dive. Britt and I have a session together. One of the things that we've written recently is the Response and Remedy Toolkit. There are some case studies in there for what businesses have done to improve their response. And we also have something called the Modern Slavery Benchmarking Tool. This is a self-assessment that companies take, and then the result at the end is a handy to-do list. Basically, what are the things I need to change within my company in order to make sure that my workers are protected? So those are some other resources that might help. Yeah, question from the front, please.
Thank you so much for this presentation. Very interesting. I wondered if you could speak a little bit more about the methodology. And the reason I ask is because the increase of 10 million, I wonder how much of that is attributable to a more robust methodology that you've been able to undertake, and how much is that actual raw numbers of a growing problem in the world?
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. That increase is an effect of both the compounding crises that we've seen over the last 5 years, but also of improvements to the methodology. So specifically on changes to methodology. So we produce the global estimates of modern slavery with the International Labour Organization and the International Organization for Migration. And we released the last edition in September last year. And the global estimates, they form the starting point of our national estimates that we present here in the Global Slavery Index. So that's very much WalkFree's own work, the Global Slavery Index, but the global estimates, we work with the ILO and the IOM. So in terms of improvements to the methodology, we have a much larger scope. So as I mentioned at the start of the session, in the last edition of the Global Estimates of Modern Slavery, we had just 48 national surveys which were informing our estimates. In this edition, in last year's edition of the global estimates, we had 75 national estimates. So we had a very much an increase in the number of surveys, though I do want to mention that 48 of those surveys were resurveyed, had been undertaken for the 2018 estimates, and then were resurveyed again, those countries, just for comparability sake. We also improved the way that we count cases in the country of exploitation in the most recent global estimates. And so certainly what we do see are some of those changes over time are attributable to the methodology. But what we have also seen is that cannot be fully explained by the methodology. And so we do see that it is these, the impact of, protracted conflicts, climate change, environmental degradation, exacerbated by climate change, increasing consumerism. These are the things that are driving that increase over time. So yes, it's certainly a bit of both in short.
I have a question. Can I?
Yes, please.
So I'm Alicia. I work with UNHCR Indonesia. So in terms of the numbers earlier, I saw Indonesia is one of them, being one of the highest there. Does that your calculation, is that with refugees as well, or is just the? And obviously with the economy in Indonesia and refugees not having the rights to work over there, I'm sure there's plenty of cases that they are forced to work. Is there any maybe solution or methods on decreasing the numbers, let's just say?
I'll answer that one. Certainly throughout the report, we do make recommendations that relate to sort of the themes that we discuss, and displacement is certainly one of those topics. So for example, we talk about in displacement settings, making sure that there are modern slavery is addressed within human rights responses as well. So ensuring that humanitarians responding in, for example, to natural disasters are also trained on identification of forced labour, human trafficking, other forms of modern slavery. So certainly we do discuss that throughout the report. In terms of Thailand and its estimate and whether this reflects also the risk to refugees, we don't directly estimate from national surveys. So what we use is risk modelling, which for anyone who's interested, I won't go into it now, but if you would like to know a little bit more, I'll be discussing the methodology in the next session. In the next half of the session. So we base our estimate for Thailand, but both on individual level risk factors from our surveys, but also on those country level risk factors. For example, displaced population. So that is definitely taken into account, that the size of the displaced population within Thailand, that is factored in, but we're not surveying refugees to produce those estimates. So something that we acknowledge we would love to be able to improve with our surveys is accessing some of those communities which we know are high risk but quite hard to access through national surveys, household surveys that we tend to conduct.
Excuse me, I got a question. Can I ask? Okay. Very good morning. My name is Farul Nizam. I'm from Malaysia, FGB Holdings. So basically, I was impressed with your numbers. So basically, in FGB also, we now currently running a survey. I just wonder what is the effective of how effective of doing the survey and how we need to do it correctly, and how we manage the perception of the survey, which is maybe they will say the validity of survey. What is the percentage of valid the survey is? Can you explain more on that? Thanks.
Maybe that's probably a good one for the next session. It sounds like you want to
Next session.
more about methodology. So in the next half of the session,
Yeah, because we are in the midst of doing that also. So okay, next.
Absolutely, there are certainly shortfalls in terms of identifying or estimating modern slavery through surveys. It is obviously a very sensitive topic, and it's something that people are not necessarily, readily or willing to talk about to interviewers. So very happy to discuss some of those barriers. However, I must say that, nationally representative household surveys are the gold standard for producing these kind of estimates at the moment. So, and that's why we continue to conduct surveys. But please, yes, come to the methodology session after, and I'm happy to ask any more detailed questions on surveys. Thanks.
Brilliant. Well, I think just in conscious of time, how about we move over to there's 2 questions in the chat, and then after that we'll move into our shift and share, and happy to continue discussions and more questions and answers there.
I'll read out the questions.
Oh, you read them out. Thank you.
So we've got one from Jacob. Has WalkFree considered research including estimates on the number of traffickers per country or in the region as a measure of increasing or decreasing risk to migrant workers? Or do we have any insights into worker trust or reliance on local law enforcement or justice systems to report abuses? Both fantastic questions. We don't have any estimates on the number of traffickers per country. I know that there are organisations that are looking into conducting this type of research. We are not, but certainly we see the value in understanding not just the vulnerability, but also the motivation to exploit in this type of way. So sorry that we can't provide you any more information on that side. In terms of insights into worker trust or reliance on local law enforcement, again, it's not something that we focus on in our surveys. However, we did conduct surveys with returned migrant workers from the Arab States region in 2021. And we interviewed returned migrant workers in 6 countries, which are major source countries for migrant workers to the Arab States region. And we do ask about what their motivations are, whether they went to seek help from law enforcement. If they did, what was their experience? If they didn't, why not? What were the barriers? So that is not published just yet, but for anyone interested, and just to mention, so the source countries included Indonesia, Philippines, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Ethiopia. Yeah, so that research will be published. We're aiming to publish it in the coming year. So please keep your eyes peeled. And if that's of interest to you, hopefully we can provide you some answers in that upcoming research.
And I'll just add to that as well. In the GSI, we've got a spotlight on the kafala system, which features analysis from interviews that we conducted with survivors who experienced exploitation in the Gulf states. And some of those questions were around experiences with law enforcement and the ability to report their, how workers felt they could report their situation. So that is also included in the report. So I encourage you to take a look at that.
We also had an online question from Sarah, who is interested in the reaction of governments regarding our findings. We mentioned Thailand. Are there other governments that officially use the data, and what are their response? Do they deny or do they use it to improve protection, for instance? Yes, so we do certainly have both positive and negative reactions from governments. We are very grateful to see that in government reports and information that they put out on modern slavery. For example, in Australia, they cite the Global Slavery Index, and it is a quite widely cited resource, including by governments. Certainly there have been governments in the past who have reacted to the numbers. However, I guess just to say that, you know, we're very transparent about our methodology, and, you know, we're happy to sort of, you know, work with governments if there are any questions around how we conduct the research. So yeah, I hope that answers the question, Sarah.
Now we're going to move into the shift and share portion of the session. So just bear with me for a moment as I explain how this will all work. So we have 4 different stations. The first one is going to be with Serena Grant, who's sitting at the front here. She's our head of business engagement, and she's running a session on investing in exploitation. So this looks at what investors are doing, where their risks are, and what they're doing to respond. Serena will be on this side of the room at a table, and each of us are just going to sort of pitch up with one table. So gather around whichever station you would like to, pull chairs, whatever you need to do to move around the furniture, that's fine. At the back of the room will be Gabrielle and Catherine, and their session focuses on importing risk. So where are businesses' risks in their supply chains? Then at the side of the room over here will be Elise Gordon. She'll be speaking on methodology. And at the front, using the screen, will be Brittany and myself, and we'll take you through some of the online tools, a bit of a demo of how you can use them. If you are here and using an interpreter, then can I please ask that you attend sessions 1 and then 2 and then 3? And sorry to miss out on the front one, but it is web-based, so you can use those tools yourself. And what we will do is we'll pass the microphone around. So firstly, the microphone will be with Serena, then with Gabby, then with Elise, so that you can listen into those sessions as well. I hope that's all right, and please flag if there are any issues with that. So yeah, now we'll just take a little bit of time to reshuffle the room and move into our sessions in a few minutes' time. So thanks. Each session will be, it was 20 minutes, but I think we can move it to 15 to try and save some time. 15 minutes per session, 3 times. You get to choose 3. And I'll give you a warning when one session is finishing. I'll give a sort of 1-minute warning so we can wrap up any questions and then move on to the next one. Thank you.